Welcome back, Hughes History students, to Mr. Howe's YouTube video lessons. This is for Chapter 15, Section 4. When we studied and went over Chapter 15, Section 3, we talked about three big things that put the country at the breaking point as far as splitting up into slave states and non-slave states. And one of those things was the formation of the Republican Party with their prohibition, meaning prohibiting new states from adding to the Union that allowed slavery. We talked about the Dred Scott decision, how that decision by the Supreme Court inflamed the North, even though the South was very happy about it. And of course we talked about John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which was an attempt by a white Northerner abolitionist to lead a slave rebellion, and that is sometimes called the Meteor by some historians. So today in Chapter 15, Section 4, we're going to be talking about the events that led to the actual secession. Well, the causes of the Civil War are obvious. Slavery. You might be able to bring in states' rights and sectionalism, meaning how the different sections just had a lot of disagreements. But even if you're going to say state rights was a cause, what was the main state right? It was the right to keep and own slaves. What was the main sectional difference? The owning of slaves in the South. So you can't get away from the fact that slavery is what caused the Civil War. But that question and answer is a little bit different from, well, why did the Southern states secede in 1860 and 1861? And that's what this section addresses. And of course, the main cause is going to be the election of a Republican, Abraham Lincoln, in November of 1860 to the presidency. So before we get into the details of the lesson, let's take a look at some proving behavior. And I'd also like to go over with you a map that I'm going to have you work on after you view this lesson and correct your section assessment. So here are the objectives and the proving behavior. Our objective is to demonstrate an understanding of how the election of Lincoln from the Republican Party led to the Southern states to secede from the Union. And the proving behavior is that I'm going to ask you to label on a map all the states that did and did not support Lincoln in the 1860 election and how that affected secession. There's a lot of questions I'm going to have you answer to. So, but that's the proving behavior, is to do another electoral map. Why it matters today. This was the only time in U.S. history that states followed through with their threat to secede from the Union of the United States. And the connection to today is kind of interesting. Is it possible that we could become so divided as a country that modern threats of secession might occur? When I first started teaching, I believed what a historian wrote down, that the United States fought the Civil War in order to become a country where a civil war or secession no longer seemed possible. And I really believe that, but recently I've started to question that. I wondered, are we becoming so divided that it's possible that there could be threats of secession again? When you take a look at how divided we are about President Trump, and liberals versus conservatives, and Democrats versus Republicans, coastal and city folk versus rural folk. It seems like today we are as disunited as we've ever been, at least in my lifetime. So it does make you wonder if threats of secession are something that could occur, but hopefully not, because as we've learned from the past, this Civil War in the 1860s was the most destructive war in American history. So now what I'd like you to do before we move on to the lesson is to take a look at the worksheets that I'd like you to open up, because I've sent them to you as an attachment. Open these worksheets up, and I want to go over the reading and what I'd like you to turn in when you're finished after you view this YouTube lesson. So after you've clicked on the assignment on School Loop, and then after you click on the assignment, you'll see the attachment. There are 4 pages for you to print out. The first 2 pages are just the reading that I'd like you to read, outline, highlight, annotate, just so I have some evidence that you read it. And then you'll be able to answer the questions after you read it. So it talks about the background events, the candidates, it talks about the election results. And then after you finish reading it, I'd like you to take a look at the last 2 pages. So let's take a look at that now. So the last 2 pages, these are the pages that I want you to show me that you've completed them. I'll just have to trust that you've done the annotations and the highlighting on the other pages. But the first page you can see is another electoral map. So you'll have to look at the state, look at who they voted for. In this case, Alabama voted for Breckinridge, and you'll have to have 4 colors, one for Abraham Lincoln, one for Stephen Douglas, one for John Bell, one for John C. Breckinridge. So once again, we have that situation of more than 2 candidates running for presidency. And when we get to the reading, you'll see how bad it was for the Democrats when they split up into Northern and Southern Democrats. But anyway, so you'll read the state, look at who got the electoral vote, who got the most votes in that state, and you'll color in the state depending upon which candidate and depending upon which color that you chose. And then there are 25 questions for you to answer regarding the reading. So that's what I'd like you to do and have that ready by the due date on Google Classroom. Now let's go ahead and go through the chapter and take a look at some of the pictures and some of the ideas that you read as you completed your section assessment. So here we go. Let's take a look at chapter 15, section 4. And on the first page, on page 471, it talks about the Republican National Convention in 1860. It shows a painting of what the convention looked like inside of a Chicago convention hall. And it's interesting to note that Abraham Lincoln wasn't favored to win the nomination. There was a more conservative candidate, William Seward of New York, who was looked upon as the favorite. But because of Lincoln's rise to fame with the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, and because so many of his speeches were republished across the North and the South, he was looked upon as being, the best candidate for the Republicans. So he eventually won the nomination, and of course that really bothered the South because they knew, or they didn't believe him when he said he didn't believe in ending slavery, just restricting the expansion or the spread of slavery. No new states could be added. So that was the main part of the Republican platform. One of the big things that affects the election, though, is the Democrats. And the Democrats couldn't decide on a nominee, and they kept having these conventions, and the Southerners wanted someone who was staunchly slavery. The Northern Democrats wanted someone who was more of a compromiser, kind of a moderate on the issue of slavery. And so the Democrats split into 2 different Democrats, the Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. And in reality, that's going to be why Lincoln wins. If all the Democrats had held together and voted together as one block, then whoever the Democrats would have chosen would have won this election. But the split of the Democrats is what allows Lincoln to win the election of 1860. Might be similar to the argument about why Trump was able to win in 2016, because a lot of Democrats, not a lot, but enough Democrats split from the party and voted for Jill Stein of the Green Party, that perhaps if those Democrats had stayed loyal Democrats, then Trump would not have won the states that he won in that were so close, like Michigan and Pennsylvania. So similar, maybe we can bring that up there as a parallel to today. So then you have the actual election of 1860. There's a campaign drawing showing the political race, and it says the cartoon of the long-legged Abe Lincoln shows him to be the fittest candidate in the 1860 presidential election. I wonder if this was actually done after the election, after he had won, because it does show him winning, and I'm not sure if that was such a for sure thing leading up to the election. But I would like to point out to you the election of 1860 map that is on page 473. And this will be a very helpful map for you, because after you watch this video, I'd like you to click on an attachment that's connected to this assignment, and do a reading about this election. And if you have questions about the map, you could just basically use this map as a guide to follow, because it shows all the same states and how they voted and how many electoral votes each state had, and how Lincoln clearly got the number that he needed. However, I would like you to notice, if you add the popular vote together for Douglas, the Northern Democrat, and for Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, then they basically would have had 2 million votes compared to Lincoln's 1,865,000. It is also interesting to note that Lincoln was basically a minority president. And when I say that, I mean that he did not get a majority of the popular vote. He did get a majority of the electoral vote, very similar to Trump. You know, Trump got the electoral votes that he needed to become president, even though when you add up all the votes together across the country, Hillary Clinton got almost 3 million more votes than Trump did. But the point is, that's not what the rules in the Constitution say. The rules in the Constitution say you have to win a majority of the electoral vote. And Lincoln did get a majority of the electoral vote, but he only got about 40% of the popular vote. So that means 60% of Americans in 1860 wanted somebody else other than Lincoln to be president. It is kind of ironic in that Abraham Lincoln becomes, I would guess, the most popular president of all time if you were to take a poll of most Americans. Well, the election of Lincoln, and we also have to understand in the reading, it does say that the southern states threatened to secede if Lincoln got elected. Now, that was a pretty serious threat, but don't forget there have been other threats in the past. In chapter 10, we learned about how the New England states threatened to secede because they were against the War of 1812. In chapter 12, we learned that South Carolina threatened to secede because of the so-called Tariff of Abominations. So I don't know if the Republicans took it very seriously when the southern states threatened to secede if Abraham Lincoln did get the majority of electoral votes and became President-elect Lincoln. But this time they followed through with their threat. Within a couple of weeks of Lincoln being announced the winner and the next president of the United States, South Carolina issues a Declaration of Independence, basically saying that they are no longer part of the United States, that they are a free and independent country, no longer part of the United States. So they were kind of following the history of the colonies. When the colonies declared independence from Great Britain and formed the United States of America, they basically followed that same format. South Carolina declared independence, and those of you that may have questions about, why do some people say it wasn't so much about slavery, it was more about states' rights, it was more about sectionalism, I challenge you to look at the Declaration of Independence from South Carolina in 1860, and it's very clear that they were seceding over slavery. There's not a doubt in any historian's minds that actually looks at primary sources that slavery was the cause of South Carolina's secession. Very quickly after that, still during that time when President Lincoln is still President-elect Lincoln, he's not the president yet, he's just the President-elect, because they weren't swearing in presidents in January back in those days, they were swearing in presidents in March. 6 other states decide to declare independence, and they decide to have a big meeting in Montgomery, Alabama. We're going to talk more about what they decided in Montgomery, Alabama in our next YouTube lesson. But they form the Confederate States of America. They write a constitution for the Confederate States of America, and I'd like you to consider why they chose that name, the Confederate States of America, because now you have the USA, the United States of America in the north, and you have the CSA, the Confederate States of America in the south. Why did they choose the word Confederate for their country, Confederate States of America. And hopefully, one of the things you might remember is that we studied a document. The first Constitution of the United States was called the Articles of Confederation. And one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation is that it allowed the states to be more powerful than the national government. That's exactly what the Southerners wanted. Because if the states were more powerful than the national government, then the national government couldn't tell them they couldn't have slavery. That became a state right, and if the other states decided not to get rid of, or decided to get rid of slavery, and another state wanted to keep slavery, they could say, okay, if you guys want to get rid of slavery in your state, that's fine, but in our state, we're going to keep slavery. So once again, naming the country the Confederate States of America goes back to the Articles of Confederation. It's one of the reasons why we spent so much time learning and studying that, so that you could understand that connection between 1860 and 1861 Confederate States of America and the fact that they wanted to go back to that document and not have a strong national government as in the Constitution, have a weaker national government as in the Articles of Confederation. That's why they became known as the Confederacy. On page 474, one of the cool parts of history at this point is that you can see photographs. And when Lincoln is actually sworn in as president, there's a photograph of that happening. And you can take a look at Lincoln standing there reading his speech, the first inaugural address. And it's one of those cool things. You know, Lincoln already had a reputation as being a great speaker, and his first inaugural address is one of those great speeches in American history, and it has part of that first inaugural address in there, and I'd like you to read that real quickly with me. It says, "We are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." So this is after, the southern states have formed a new country, they've written a constitution, they've elected a Confederate States president, Jefferson Davis, and yet you still have Lincoln trying to say, hey guys, we are not enemies, we're Americans, we're all together on this, we should not be breaking up, we can solve this without breaking up into two countries. It goes on in the speech, "The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature." So he's appealing to the Southerners with the history, saying, hey, we have a history of being together. We have a history of being a country. Don't break this apart. Although one part it doesn't say in the inaugural address in your book, he does address the prospect of civil war. And he does say to the Southerners in this first speech, he says, if there is a war, it will not be because of me or the North. It will be because of you. And basically plants the seeds. If you start something, we are going to finish it. So at that point, they're still kind of waiting for that first shot to be fired, and we'll talk about that in the next section. But now let's go over the terms and names and the main ideas, the critical thinking question, and make sure you add that extra bubble map that we're going to go over in just a second. So now that we've read the chapter and looked at the pictures, talked about some of the big issues, I'm sure you were happy to see there's only 5 terms and names for you to write about. And some of these terms we've talked about before. The word platform in a political sense means it's a statement of beliefs. Every political party has a statement of beliefs. And of course, the most controversial platform in the 1860 election was the Republican statement that they would not allow any new states to enter the Union with slavery. Their platform was very clear. Lincoln was very clear. He didn't believe anything could be done about slavery in the states that had slavery for centuries. But the Republicans did believe and hoping that slavery would die a slow death as long as they prevented its growth. And that was a big part of their platform. The word to secede is connected to the word secession. And to secede means to formally withdraw from the Union. And as soon as it was announced that Lincoln had won the election by getting the majority of electoral votes that he needed, we talked about how South Carolina declares independence from the United States and officially secedes from the Union. And that leads to 6 more states joining with South Carolina. And they form a new country in Montgomery, Alabama, called the Confederate States of America. And we talked about why they chose that word Confederate. And they chose Jefferson Davis as the president of the Confederacy. And the last term was about a last chance compromise plan to try to get the southern states not to secede, called the Crittenden Plan. However, the compromise was not agreed to by the Congress, and Abraham Lincoln rejected it as well. So take a moment, if you have to, pause the video and add to your terms and names if you need to. Right after that is, of course, the required bubble map, and it's different than the using graphics on page 475 that you were asked to do. So you've got to make sure you add this bubble map. And in the middle, it shows Lincoln is elected president, and it just kind of shows 4 of the big events that happened having to do with Lincoln as elected. So the first one was done for you. South Carolina secedes. And then you have, in addition to South Carolina, 6 others for a total of 7 southern states form the Confederate States of America. They elect a president of the Confederate States of America, shortened CSA. Jefferson Davis is the first and ends up being only president of the Confederacy. And then basically in this last circle, I'd like you to write about how even at this point they tried to compromise, to try to get the southern states to come back into the Union, but it doesn't pass Congress. The Northerners don't want to cave in to what the Confederates wanted them to do. So once again, pause the video. Make sure you have this bubble map on your section assessment when you snap a picture of it and turn it in, or if you're doing it on Google Docs. Most of you do a wonderful job of including this, so you can get full credit A for this assignment. And then here are the main idea questions. And once again, as we go over this and we talk about the answers, if there's something in your answer that doesn't sound right, you can fix it, you can cross it out, you can add to it if there's just some extra information that you'd like to add. So feel free to pause at any time and to add these ideas to your paper. So letter A says, who were the candidates in the 1860 presidential election and what policies did each candidate stand for? And the first question, Lincoln, representing the Republicans, opposed the expansion of slavery into the new territories. Breckinridge, representing the Southern Democrats, believed the federal government should protect slavery. Douglas, representing the Northern Democrats, believed in popular sovereignty, deciding slavery. That means people voting on slavery wherever they lived in the territories. And Bell, representing the constitutional unionists, believed in preserving the Union. They were kind of vague in how that was supposed to be done given the arguing over slavery, but believed in preserving the Union at all costs. So we talked about how Lincoln, even though he didn't like slavery, was still of the opinion that nothing could be done about slavery because it's in the Constitution. Unless you change the Constitution, the people who have slavery are allowed to have slavery in the states where it's been for centuries. But he also believed that no new states should be added to the United States. Letter B says, what states seceded right after Lincoln's election and how did they justify this action? South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas were the first 7 states to secede. Eventually 4 more will join. Their leaders argued that since the states had joined the Union voluntarily, they could choose to leave the Union voluntarily. So once again, you get into this argument of states' rights, and it's connected to the argument regarding the interpretation of the Constitution. Do states have to follow national laws if the states think that they're against the Constitution, the issue of nullification. So nullification and secession were arguable points, and it goes back to those discussions that we had early on in the school year, where we said, if the Constitution specifically says that you can't do it, then you can't. But the Constitution doesn't say you can't secede. So in the arguments of the Southerners, maybe you can. Letter C says, what attempts did the North and South make to compromise? What were the results? Some Northerners and Southerners in Congress attempted to compromise with the Crittenden Plan, named after one of the people in Congress who wrote the plan, Mr. Crittenden. However, it was too late to compromise. The Confederate States of America had already been established, and the nation waited to see what President Lincoln was going to do. Because don't forget, all of this was happening before Lincoln was technically president. It was, he's elected in November, but back in those days, the new president wasn't sworn in till March. So between November and March is when all this crazy stuff with secession is happening in the South, and Lincoln really can't do anything until he becomes the president. And finally, the critical thinking question. Do you think the Southern states seceded to protect slavery or states' rights? To me, it's kind of a dumb question, and it really goes back to those Southern apologists that try to say that, well, it wasn't really slavery, it was states' rights. But you're allowed to have your own opinion, so answers may vary. Students might argue that they were defending the rights of the states or feared the abolition of slavery. However, the main state right they were fighting to defend was slavery. To me, there can be really no argument as far as why they seceded. It was about slavery, and if you don't believe me, I challenge you to go look up on Google the Declaration of Independence by the state of South Carolina. That's a primary source, and in that document it explains exactly why South Carolina seceded. And slavery was at the forefront of almost all of their arguments why they were seceding. So to me, it's kind of a dumb thing to say that slavery wasn't the main cause of secession. So why was the election of Lincoln so threatening to the Southern states that they would secede or break away from the United States and form a new country, the Confederate States of America? Well, for decades, the Southern states did not control the House of Representatives. It's because of the population of the North was bigger than the population of the South. So their first idea was to hold on to the Senate. As long as they could preserve that balance or have a majority in the Senate, any law restricting slavery that passed through the House could be defeated in the Senate. When California became a state and gave the free states the advantage, the Southern states no longer controlled the House, and now starting in 1850, they did not control the Senate. So a law at that point during the 1850s could have been passed that would restrict slavery through the House and also through the Senate. So at that point, the main goal of the South was to maintain control of the presidency. As long as they had a president that would veto restrictions about slavery, the Southerners felt safe. So when in 1860 you had a Republican who, although he said he was going to do nothing about slavery where it already existed, he was only going to prevent the addition of new states to the United States that had slavery. When he became president, the Southerners didn't believe that he was going to be only a president that restricted the growth of slavery. They really thought that, oh, he's a Republican, he's probably an abolitionist. Now he won't stop laws that will restrict slavery everywhere in the United States. So that fear is going to inspire South Carolina to declare independence. 6 other states are going to follow. They're going to form the Confederate States of America. And all this is happening before Lincoln is even the president, because don't forget, the president is not the president until the March of the following year back in those days, not January like it is today. So all this is happening before Lincoln is actually the president. So in the next lesson, we're going to talk about what the decisions that Lincoln has to make as soon as he is the president, and it's going to lead, the decisions that Lincoln makes are going to lead to the greatest war in American history in terms of lives lost. So until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, remember to subscribe and ring that bell. See you next time.